Hey y'all, so I wanted to do something a little different today and go through some flashcards that I have made. They're pretty much all behavioral sciences, mostly behavioral biology, because that's what I've been looking at a lot. A lot of that stuff is really high yield, particularly when it comes to organization of the nervous system and the brain, that sort of stuff. So I've got this little tiny stack of flashcards here. So what I was thinking I was going to do is just go through the flashcards, and then after I read it, I'll pause for a second so those of y'all watching at home can try to answer it, and then I'll show the answer and probably talk a little bit about the answer as well, at least as much as I know about it. I also was going to talk a little bit about my method for how I make flashcards and that sort of stuff. So if that's something that you'd like to do with me, then keep watching. So we'll go ahead and start at the beginning. The three types of neurons in the nervous system are, this one's dirty. So three types of neurons in the nervous system. So one, there's motor or efferent. Two, there's the inner neurons. And then three, there's sensory or afferent. So the way I was taught to remember the difference between the motor neurons and the sensory neurons and what they do, so the difference between the efferent and the afferent, the kind of mnemonic that I was taught was afferent neurons descend, what was it? Oh, geez, I hope I can remember it now. Oh yeah, afferent neurons ascend in the cord towards the brain. So afferent neurons, or the sensory neurons, ascend towards the brain. Then efferent neurons, or the motor neurons, they exit the cord and then go away out to the rest of the body. So that's the way I was taught to remember the difference between afferent and efferent, which can be kind of tough because even those two words can be kind of difficult to remember the difference between. So it's good to have a helpful mnemonic there. All right, next flashcard. Blank neurons transmit sensory information from receptors to the brain and spinal cord. All right, just said this. So it's either the motor or efferent, or it's the sensory or afferent. So the ones that transmit the information to the brain and spinal cord, the ones that ascend to the brain and spinal cord, those are the afferent or the sensory. I hesitated a little bit there. I do get these mixed up sometimes, so it's good that we're going over these. Okay, the next one. Blank neurons transmit motor information from the spinal cord and brain to the muscles and glands. So this is the other one. So it is motor or efferent neurons that transmit motor information from the spinal cord and brain to the muscles and glands. Blank are located predominantly in the brain and spinal cord and are often linked to reflexive behavior. I'll give you a little hint. So there were three types of neurons that we talked about. We talked about the motor, we talked about the sensory, and then this is the third kind. So this is the interneurons. Neural circuits called blank control reflexive behavior. That's the reflex arcs. The blank is made up of nerve tissues and fibers outside the brain and spinal cord, including all 31 pairs of spinal nerves and 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The key there is outside the brain and spinal cord. So we know the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So what's outside the brain and spinal cord? That's the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. I also should mention the ones that I made cards for are things that I felt like I needed to work on. So if there's any concepts that you feel like I skipped over, or I don't have any cards for them, it's probably just because those were concepts that I didn't really feel like I needed to review a lot, so I didn't make cards for them. So that's why if it seems like I'm skipping anything. The peripheral nervous system can be divided into the blank and the blank. So what are the two different divisions of the peripheral nervous system? That's the somatic and autonomic. The somatic nervous system consists of That's sensory and motor neurons distributed throughout the skin, joints, and muscles. So that's what we have in the somatic nervous system. The blank generally regulates heartbeat, respiration, digestion, and glandular secretions. Okay. So the last one was the somatic nervous system. This is the other one. That's the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. Think like autonomic, automatic. These are the things that just happen automatically without us having to think about them. Things like our heartbeat, our respiration, our digestion, the secretion of our glands. We don't need to sit and think about doing those things like we would need to sit and think about stuff like moving our joints and muscles from the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system can be divided further into blank and blank. So what are the two different divisions of the autonomic nervous system? This is where we get into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Blank is the neurotransmitter responsible for parasympathetic responses in the body. What's that neurotransmitter? It's acetylcholine. Yay! Pretend like we're on a game show. Gotta make studying fun. You gotta, or you'll go insane. I say that like I'm not already insane. The parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is focused on, which one is this? It's one of the rhymey ones. So the parasympathetic is the rest and digest responses, we call it. The sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is focused on, another rhyme. So the sympathetic is the fight or flight. Let's see. Okay, now we're getting into the brain. The brain is covered with a thick sheath of connective tissue called, those are the meninges, those things that connect your brain, basically anchor it into your skull. If you're familiar with the illness called meningitis, it's probably something that people have heard of. There was people were talking about it a lot, maybe a few years back, maybe 10 years back or so. People were really talking about meningitis a lot. It was spreading around a lot. But in case you wondered, meningitis, what that does is it affects your meninges, which is part of why when people have meningitis, they have just such intense pain in their head. They have such intense headaches because we're getting swelling of the meninges. And any kind of brain swelling is very dangerous because, as you can imagine, your skull doesn't give. I mean, it's a bone, it's solid. So if your brain swells in it, it really doesn't have anywhere to go. And that's how people can die from really any kind of brain swelling, but meningitis in particular, when the meninges are swelling. So what is the function of the meninges? What do we have them for? Why do we want something covering our whole brain? Well, there's really three main reasons. One, they protect the brain. They keep it all safe. Two, they keep it anchored within the skull, which is kind of what I was talking about. And then three, they also can resorb cerebrospinal fluid. So those are their three main jobs that they play. So the meninges have three layers. What are they? So the topmost is the dura mater. Then we have the arachnoid matter. And then below that, we have the pia mater. The way I remember that, so this goes from outermost to innermost, is it actually spells DAP. I know, not really a word, but it works for me. DAP, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. What is the aqueous solution in which the brain and spinal cord rests? Actually, just said it a couple cards ago. So that's cerebrospinal fluid. What are the three basic subdivisions of the human brain? Now, this can get actually a little tricky once you start learning so much about the brain and just how many different parts and lobes and divisions it has. But what are the three main divisions? Well, it actually, if we're going to go from front to back, first there's the hindbrain back here, and midbrain here, and then forebrain here. So that's actually pretty easy because they're basically just named after where they are. So those are the three main divisions. Together, the hindbrain and the midbrain form that's called the brainstem, what the hindbrain and the midbrain form together. a group of neural structures primarily associated with emotion and memory. So there's a couple different structures in the brain. Actually, there has been some debate in the last few years about exactly what structures make up this system, so this can be a little tricky. But when you think about emotion and memory, what you should think about is the limbic system. Really, all those structures like the hypothalamus, the amygdala, those sorts of things, those are all in the limbic system. Then the limbic system is a part of the, where is that system? That's in the forebrain. So if you think about, for this one, I think it's actually helpful to think about how and when the different parts of the brain developed. So it's pretty much agreed upon that the hindbrain was the first sort of part of the brain to develop. It has a lot of those very primitive functions that we talk about, kind of lower brain functions. And then moving from back to front, when we get up to the forebrain, that's when we get a lot of the more complex functions of the brain: emotion, memory, feelings, fear, aggression, those sorts of things. So the limbic system that has a lot of emotion and memory, that's a part of the forebrain because those are some of the more complex functions of the brain. Aggression, fear, pleasure, and pain are all related to the, that one's also the limbic system. These flashcards I made from a couple different sources, so they are kind of redundant. I apologize for that, but I think redundancy can be a little helpful actually to hear questions asked in slightly different ways, because I would imagine, actually I do know because I've taken the MCAT before, that the way questions are asked on the MCAT are probably not going to be verbatim the way they are asked in your textbook or the way they're written in their textbook. So it's actually good to hear them asked slightly different ways rather than hearing verbatim the same question over and over again. The blank is the outer covering of the cerebral hemispheres. That is the cerebral cortex. The hindbrain is also known as the, think about what it's called when it's developing. That's the rhombencephalon. The hindbrain controls, so remember, those are kind of the very basic functions, the primitive functions. So the hindbrain controls balance, motor coordination, breathing, digestion, and general arousal processes like sleeping and waking. Those are all the hindbrain. During embryonic development, the rhombencephalon divides to form, so it divides into two different pieces, the very back part of the brain. The rhombencephalon divides into the metencephalon and the myencephalon, and that's going from front to back in between those two processes. The myencephalon then becomes, so remember that's the very back one. Does that help? That becomes the medulla oblongata, that thing in the very back. The metencephalon then becomes, what else is back there? The pons and the cerebellum. The medulla oblongata is a lower brain structure that is responsible for, so lower brain structures, those hindbrain structures, what kind of things do they do? Regulating vital functions. So things like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure, things that we don't think about, things that are a little more primitive. The blank lies above the medulla and contains sensory and motor pathways between the cortex and the medulla. What's right above the medulla? Comes from the metencephalon. That's the pons. The blank helps maintain posture and balance and coordinate body movements. This is another hindbrain structure. That's the cerebellum. Damage to the cerebellum causes, I actually think it can be very helpful to think about brain, parts of the brain in those terms of that, when they get damaged or when they get removed, then what is missing in that person. So when you damage the cerebellum, what do we end up with? That's when we end up with clumsiness, slurred speech, and loss of balance. Kind of like a drunk person, a little bit. The blank receives sensory and motor information from the rest of the body and associated with involuntary reflex responses triggered by visual or auditory stimuli. That wasn't probably the best grammar, but... So that would be the midbrain or the mesencephalon. The midbrain contains, there's two divisions of the midbrain. That's the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. I'm not sure if I have any cards on what exactly those two do, but the inferior colliculus, what that does is it sort of, it manages your reflexive reactions to loud noises. So if you're a very jumpy person, you know, loud noises will make you jump, or when you watch scary movies, you jump a lot. That's your inferior colliculus. So I kind of like to joke, I guess, among my nerdy friends that I have a very enlarged or very hyperactive inferior colliculus because I am a very jumpy person. I really do. I jump at the drop of a pin. So that's sort of a little joke that I make that actually helps me remember what it does. Let's see. The blank is associated with complex perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral processes. So once again, this is something we've talked about, but kind of asked a different way. So that is the forebrain. During prenatal development, the prosencephalon divides to form the blank and the blank. Prosencephalon, what does that turn into? That's the telencephalon and the diencephalon. These things I think can be really helpful to draw a diagram of, or even just print one out. I think there's one here in this book that I'll go ahead and show to y'all. This I think is a very helpful image right here. So it shows the different divisions, the subdivisions of the embryonic brain and how they divide up. I went ahead and did a very poor drawing of that myself, but I'll show you the one in the textbook because that looks a lot better. The telencephalon forms the, so that's in the forebrain. So what's in the forebrain? The cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. The diencephalon forms the, that's also forebrain. That's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the posterior pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Once again, same question, just asked a slightly different way. The forebrain contains regions derived from the blank and the blank. So what two regions were those? Those were the diencephalon and the telencephalon. The thalamus is a structure that relays all senses except for, this one I think is very interesting actually. So the thalamus is often referred to as a relay center in the brain. It takes information from those senses and relays them to the rest of the brain, the rest of the body, all those senses except for smell. Smell works a little differently, and we'll probably get into that a little bit more later, but I just find that to be very interesting, that smell is the only one that bypasses the hypothalamus, and that could have a lot to do with the way certain smells really cause very interesting reactions in people, in their brains, and in the way they feel, that certain smells can bring back certain memories, because smells, just the way we process that sense works a little differently from the other senses. The blank serves homeostatic functions and is a key player in emotional experiences during high arousal states, aggressive behavior, and sexual behavior. Part of the forebrain, it's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is subdivided into, there's three parts of it. Oh, my back. So that is the lateral hypothalamus, the ventromedial hypothalamus, and the anterior hypothalamus, sometimes called the LH, the VMH, and the AH, these three parts. The hypothalamus is also the primary regulator of the blank and is important in drive behaviors, hunger, thirst, and sexual behavior. So what system does that make you think of? Hunger, thirst, and sexual behavior. That's the autonomic system, where we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, the rest and digest and the fight or flight. The blank triggers eating and drinking. That's the lateral hypothalamus, the LH. The mnemonic I was taught about this, how to remember this, is once again, if you think about what happens when that part of the brain is destroyed or removed. If you lose your hypothalamus, if you lose your lateral hypothalamus, your LH, someone who has lost that, then that person is going to lack hunger because they have lost the part of the brain that triggers their desire to eat and drink. The blank is identified as the satiety center. I have such a hard time saying that word. I don't know why. It's identified as a satiety center because it provides the signal to stop eating. So this is what tells us that we're full, this part. That's the ventromedial hypothalamus, or the VMH. Once again, another good mnemonic. If you lose your ventromedial hypothalamus, or you have it damaged, you lose your VMH, then you become very much hungry because you lost that part of your brain that told you to stop eating, that told you that you were full, and we're like, okay, stop, Lindsay, you've had enough food. Sometimes I think I lack that part of my brain too. The blank controls sexual behavior as well as sleep and body temperature. It's the last part of the hypothalamus. That's the anterior hypothalamus. Once again, mnemonic, you lose your anterior hypothalamus, you lose your AH. That is when you are asexual. It took me a second to remember when it was. So if you lose your anterior hypothalamus, you become asexual. The posterior pituitary is comprised of axonal projections from the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is the site of release for blank and blank. So two different hormones. What comes from the posterior pituitary? Well, that's the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and also oxytocin. The blank secretes a hormone called melatonin, which regulates, I can't read my writing, circadian rhythms. Oh my gosh, that is the worst writing ever. Okay, so where do we get that hormone melatonin from? That comes from the pineal gland. The blank coordinate muscle movement as they receive information from the cortex and relay this information to the brain and spinal cord. What part of the brain is that? That's the basal ganglia. A lot of muscle movement, stability, those sorts of things, those are controlled by the basal ganglia. And actually the disease, Parkinson's disease, that's one of the main brain functions that is deteriorating in people that have Parkinson's disease. You know how people with Parkinson's, they get tremors where they don't have a lot of control over their muscles, that sort of thing. That's because they have a disease that is destroying their basal ganglia. The limbic system is primarily associated with, I think we've asked this about 3 different ways, we should probably know by now, emotion and memory is the limbic system. Function of the thalamus, like I said this earlier, is the relay station for sensory information. We get that information from the senses and then it relays it to the rest of the brain. Function of the hypothalamus. Primarily just to maintain homeostasis, and it also works in conjunction with the endocrine system through the anterior pituitary, which I think I have some more cards on later. The function of the basal ganglia. Smooths movements and helps maintain postural stability. Once again, get something like Parkinson's where the basal ganglia gets deteriorated and you're not going to have very smooth movements or very stable posture anymore. The blank contain one of the primary pleasure centers in the brain. Those are the septal nuclei. Once again, finding out things about the brain, it either comes a lot of the time from when we remove or damage that part, or when we hyperstimulate that part and then can observe the kind of behavior that happens. I heard about one study, let's see if I can remember it very well, but I heard about one study they did in which they stimulated the septal nuclei in rats. So they basically stimulated their pleasure center, and they set something up, I'm not sure exactly how, but they set something up where the rats could push a button that would keep stimulating their septal nuclei and keep stimulating that pleasure center in their brain. And they saw in the rats basically addictive behavior, that they became addicted to just pressing the button over and over to stimulate that pleasure center at the expense of doing things like eating, drinking, sleeping, and a lot of the rats actually died of starvation because they were foregoing eating and drinking for the sake of just pressing that button that would stimulate their septal nuclei. So the septal nuclei, what we believe, what many scientists believe, has a lot to do with addiction. The blank is a structure that plays an important role in defensive and aggressive behaviors. That's the amygdala. That's sort of your aggression center. So if you know any kind of like meathead guys, you know, like kind of roid ragey guys, you can think to yourself, you know, maybe they got a little bit of an overstimulated amygdala going on. The blank helps consolidate information to form long-term memories and can redistribute remote memories to the cerebral cortex. So how do we form those long-term memories? That's using the hippocampus. I'm sure most people, I think, are familiar with the patient HM. We actually do know his name now. I don't remember what it was though. But he died fairly recently. I think only in like 2009 or so. And then people now know his full name. But for a long time, he was just referred to as patient HM, just to protect his privacy. But he had his hippocampus removed, and so he no longer was able to form any new long-term memories. So he remembered everything in his life up until the surgery where he lost his hippocampus, but nothing after that. Every single day, the doctors that worked with him had to reintroduce themselves to him. Everyone had to reintroduce themselves to him because he could not form any new memories. But one of the really interesting things that I heard about him is that after he had his surgery, he moved into a house with a caretaker that he had not lived in before the surgery, and was in that house every single day for years and years, walking around. And what they found was that he actually could draw a fairly accurate floor plan of the house that he walked in every day, even though he'd never been in it until after his surgery. So what that tells scientists is that there is something else, somewhere else in the brain, that allows for some sort of memory formation besides the hippocampus. There's definitely something else there that allows the formation of memory, but this is the main actor when it comes to the formation of long-term memory, because for the most part he could not store any new memories, but there's definitely something else there. We're still learning so many new things about the brain. By the time any of us take the MCAT, they'll probably have learned 20 new things about the brain. So talking about amnesia, two different kinds, anterograde and retrograde. So anterograde amnesia is characterized by, so this is what HM had by losing his hippocampus. It's where you can't establish new long-term memories. So that's the kind of amnesia that he had by losing his hippocampus. So if that's helpful, associate anterograde amnesia with HM. Retrograde amnesia is when you can't remember any of the things that happened, or not really any of the things, but you can't remember things that happened prior to the brain injury or the brain surgery, prior to that trauma to the brain. I already asked that question. All right, let's do it again. Outer surface of the brain is called cerebral cortex. All right. We all got that one? The lobes of the cerebral cortex. There's 4 of them. I guess mnemonic, I don't know if it's really, you can call it a mnemonic, more like an acronym. The acronym I was taught was FPOT, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, the different lobes of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex has bumps and folds they're called gyri and sulci. The cerebrum is divided into 2 halves those are the cerebral hemispheres. So think about half, hemi. The frontal lobe is comprised of 2 basic regions. There are 2 different cortexes, the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex. The prefrontal cortex manages executive function. So think about, anytime we're talking about anything in the frontal lobe, be thinking about terms of very complex functions, because that's more of what's in the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex supervises processes associated with, so what kind of stuff do we have going on in the frontal lobe? Perception, memory, emotion, impulse control, and long-term planning. So the main things in the prefrontal cortex. Okay. Do I have anything else on the kind of frontal lobe here? I think I do have a few more things on the frontal lobe, but before we move on, I do want to talk a little bit more about the frontal lobe. So one of the things that people, I know this is probably another case that people have heard of, the case of Phineas Gage, but I do think that when you think understanding these different parts of the brain, a very key part of understanding them is these cases where someone has that part of the brain damaged or lost, and then we see what part of them is lost. For a long time, that's really all we ever even had to learn anything about the brain. It's been pretty recent that we've been able to start doing like EEGs and brain scans and being able to learn about the brain that way as well. But Phineas Gage was a railway worker back in, I think, mid 17th century. I think it was like the middle of the 17th century, around like 1850. But he was a railway worker, and there was an accident in which a rod went straight through the front of his head. I believe went under his chin and then straight out the top. And would have thought that this would kill a man. You would have thought it would have killed him, but he was able to basically stand up and walk after it. He of course went to a hospital and was probably there for a very long time, but he lived. He survived, and but what people noted after the accident was that he was not himself after the accident. He prior to the incident, he was a very kind person, very mild-mannered person, came to work on time, was just pleasant to be around. And after the accident, he was, people noted that he became very rude, very crass, like swore a lot, was not very good to the people around him, was showing up late to work. So basically, all the things that are in the frontal lobe of the brain, in that like prefrontal cortex, those are a lot of the things that make you who you are, form your personality. And so when there was that severe damage to his frontal lobe, he really just lost pretty much everything that made him who he was. That's what the frontal lobe does, is it makes you who you are. So I think that can be really helpful with remembering what the frontal lobe does, because just thinking about the case of Phineas Gage. An association area of the brain is, so think about it in this context. So there's an association area of the brain, and there's a projection area of the brain. An association area of the brain is an area that integrates input from other regions of the brain. A projection area of the brain is an area that does more rudimentary or simple perception and motor tasks. So think about these things in contrast to each other. The primary motor cortex is located on the precentral gyrus. The blank initiates voluntary movements by sending neural impulses down the spinal cord toward the muscles. That is the primary motor cortex. So it's sending those motor neurons down towards the muscles. Okay, what else do I have? The blank is the destination for all incoming sensory signals for touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. So touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. That is the somatosensory cortex. So a lot of those senses, somatosensory. The occipital lobe contains the, think about that prefix, ox. That's the visual cortex, or sometimes called the striate cortex. Function of the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex. That's where we have the somatosensory cortex. We have those sensations. It's also where we have spatial processing, orientation, and manipulation. The auditory cortex and Wernicke's area are located in the, so think about auditory cortex, that's hearing, right? So where would you think we would probably want that? That's in our temporal lobe, so close to our ears. That just makes kind of logical sense, doesn't it? Wernicke's area is associated with language reception and comprehension. So once again, something in that temporal lobe, I think that makes sense that it would be near our ears because it's how we hear things and understand them. The Wernicke's area controls, I already did this, language comprehension, but still, repetition can be helpful. Okay, so now getting into what happens when we have damage to that. Wernicke's aphasia, that's damage to the Wernicke's lobe. What does that result in? Basically, it makes it so that you can no longer comprehend language if you have damage to your Wernicke's area. The Broca's area controls the motor function of speech. So that's what allows us to speak and make sense. So Broca's aphasia, or damage to Broca's area, that's when you, not necessarily that you can't speak, but that you have a lot of difficulty with formulating words. People that have damage to the Broca's area and have Broca's aphasia, they just have a lot of difficulty creating the kind of words. I actually, at one point in my undergrad, had a professor who had this. He had damage to his Broca's area due to, he'd had a brain tumor and had it operated on, and I guess because of where it was in his brain, there ended up being some damage to his Broca's area. He ended up with some Broca's aphasia, and he sometimes had trouble just formulating words and formulating sentences, and the way he described it is that it was up here, he knew what he wanted to say, he had, you know, all that was still working, he could still formulate the ideas and come up with them, but he just had trouble with speaking them, and so sometimes he had to just write things down because he could still do that fine. It really was just that he had trouble forming the words and forming the sentences. Function of the circulate fasciculus. I have trouble saying some of these words. Circulate fasciculus. So that connects the Wernicke's and Broca's areas. I think we would want those to be connected. At least I would want them to be connected. I would want what helps me understand words to be connected with what helps me to speak words. So if you have damage to that area, damage to the arcuate fasciculus, that's when you have something called conduction aphasia. And conduction aphasia, what does that do? So if you think about Wernicke's area, that's how we understand the words that are said. Broca's area, that's how we can then speak words. So if we have damage to the thing that's connecting those two, that's when you can hear the words and you can understand them, but you can't really, then you can't generate the words. I seem to not be explaining this very well, which is a little ironic, I think, but it's where you can hear the words and understand them because you don't have damage to the Wernicke's area. You can say words because you don't have damage to the Broca's area, but you have trouble making that connection of that the word that you heard, that you can't really then repeat it. So that's where the damage comes in. So let's review the language areas in the brain, the 3 of them. So there's the Wernicke's area, there's the Broca's area, and there's the arcuate fasciculus. Those are the 3 language areas. The dominant hemisphere is usually the, so you're left or right, you got a 50-50 shot. It's actually the left, which I think is different from what people would usually think. And that's actually true for left or right-handed people. And pretty much everyone, the left hemisphere is usually the dominant one. The dominant hemisphere is primarily associated with, so those are analytic skills, logic, language, and math skills. So that's typically what people have as their dominant hemisphere, is these sorts of things. The non-dominant hemisphere, that's what's associated with intuition, creativity, music cognition, spatial processing. I don't know if people have heard just kind of the layman terms where you say if someone's left-brained or they say someone's more right-brained. That's sort of what that's based in. It really is based in brain function, so it is true. But most people, the left hemisphere is what's dominant, which is that very kind of more concrete, logical side of the brain. But there are some people where the right hemisphere is dominant, so they're more kind of creatively inclined, or more reliant on intuition than on logic, which is fine as well. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that's what's dominant in their brain. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. Oh man, maybe we should cut this video short pretty soon. I think I'm losing my ability to speak words. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter found in both blank and blank. So acetylcholine, this is going back to what we were talking about earlier, that is found in both the central and the peripheral nervous systems. That we find that neurotransmitter in both of those. But it actually plays a different role in the central and peripheral. So in the peripheral nervous system, acetylcholine is used to transmit nerve impulses to the muscles. And then in the central nervous system, so brain and spinal cord, then what's acetylcholine used for there? That's used for attention and arousal. Okay. Moving on to some different neurotransmitters. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine are 3 closely related neurotransmitters known as, what's the term we use for those? Catecholamines. Probably a word you've at least heard of before, even if we don't really remember was from. That was when I was reviewing. I knew I'd heard that word before, but I couldn't really remember what it was for. So those catecholamines, those epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, they can be also classified as monoamines or biogenic amines. That's another term you might hear used to describe them. Catecholamines all play important roles in the experience of, so epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, they all play important roles in the experience of emotions. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are involved in controlling. So think about what epinephrine and norepinephrine are. They're like adrenaline, right? So they control alertness and wakefulness. If you give someone a shot of epinephrine, you give them a shot of adrenaline, right? That's what's in an EpiPen, like someone has if they have some sort of an allergy. It really is just a shot of pure adrenaline. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are the primary neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine acts at a blank level as a blank. I kind of bungled that. Acts at a blank level as a blank. It acts at a local level as a neurotransmitter. Epinephrine is secreted from the blank to act systematically as a blank. It's secreted from the adrenal medulla to act systematically as a hormone. Okay. Blank is the main neurotransmitter of the mesolimbic pathway. Probably difficult if we aren't familiar with the mesolimbic pathway, but this is dopamine. Dopamine is another blank that plays an important role in blank. Dopamine, just like we said earlier, that is a catecholamine, and it plays an important role in movement and posture. High concentrations of dopamine are normally found in the basal ganglia. So once again, connecting to real-life condition, to Parkinson's disease, a lot of the therapy that they receive is dopamine. That's a lot of what we give to people with Parkinson's to try to help them. And what are the effects of dopamine? They smoothen your movements and they help your posture. So if we can supplement people with Parkinson's with dopamine, that can kind of help with their tremors that they're having. Serotonin is classified as that is a monoamine or a biogenic amine neurotransmitter. Serotonin is generally thought to play roles in. So a good way to remember this is that serotonin is often prescribed to people who have issues with depression. So someone's having issues with depression, what do we want to give them that will help them out? So it plays a role in mood, eating, sleeping, and dreaming. If you have a deficiency in serotonin, that's why you could have some issues with depression, issues with appetite, not be sleeping very well, maybe having some weird dreams. So if we give someone a serotonin supplement, it can help to bring those things up. But some of the side effects of it are weight gain, because it really does increase appetite. So some of the people that go on serotonin, they have their mood improves and their sleep improves, but they end up gaining weight, and they don't really like that very much. So that's one of the negative side effects of taking serotonin as a drug to help with depression. GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. It's usually abbreviated as GABA, though. It's just so much easier than writing the whole thing out. So GABA produces blank and is generally thought to play an important role in blank. So it produces inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, and it plays an important role in stabilizing neural activity in the brain. So think about that GABA is a brain stabilizer. That's a very important key point. So GABA plays its role. It exerts its effects by causing the hyperpolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. Blank serves as an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system by increasing chloride influx into the neuron. Loaded question. That's glycine. It's also one of the 20 essential amino acids. So going to be one of our very good 20 friends in the MCAT. Glycine hyperpolarizes the postsynaptic membrane similarly to, what did I just say does that? GABA, the gamma aminobutyric acid. In general, the effects of GABA and glycine: brain stabilization, very important. Moving on to glutamate, another essential amino acid. Glutamate acts as an blank neurotransmitter in the blank. So while we have GABA and glycine that are more stabilizers in the brain, glutamate is more of an excitatory guy. He excites in the central nervous system, in the brain and spinal cord. So the effects of glutamate: brain excitation. We're almost there, y'all. We only got this many left. Thanks for sticking with me. Blank are also involved in neurotransmission. So what's another thing that's also involved in neurotransmission besides just the main neurotransmitters we've talked about? It's our peptides. And of the peptides, the most important for our purposes would be endorphins. So what are endorphins? Endorphins are natural painkillers, which is why they're so addictive, particularly for people that have chronic pain. Endorphins have actions similar to morphine and other opioids. Addictive. Okay. The two main internal communication networks in the body. Those are the nervous system and the endocrine system, and those guys work together a lot as well. The endocrine system uses chemical messengers called, what do we associate a lot with the endocrine system? Hormones. The endocrine system is slower than the nervous system because hormones travel through the bloodstream, which takes them a little longer to get where they're going, right? The endocrine and nervous systems are linked by we did talk about this a little bit earlier, see if we remember. What links them? The hypothalamus up in your brain. The blank directly connects the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. That is the hypophyseal portal system. The pituitary gland is divided into, so for the pituitary gland, we just say the anterior pituitary gland and posterior pituitary gland. Whew, I think I've had just about enough. Get through the rest of these. The anterior pituitary releases hormones that regulate activities of the endocrine glands. The anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, that lovely guy. The adrenal glands are divided into the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. These are guys we talk about a lot once we get into biochemistry as well. The adrenal medulla releases blank and blank as part of the sympathetic system. What were those two guys that were in the sympathetic system? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex produces hormones called blank, including the stress hormone blank. So it produces hormones called corticosteroids. And what's a big corticosteroid you hear about a lot? Cortisol. The adrenal cortex contributes to sexual functioning by producing blank hormones, such as blank and blank. What do we make in the adrenal cortex? It's where we make sex hormones. What are the two sex hormones? Testosterone and estrogen. And then, of course, those also come from the gonads as well. Blank is the extent to which a trait or behavior positively benefits a species by influencing the evolutionary fitness of the species. Excuse me. What's the name for that? That's the adaptive value. The adaptive value is the extent to which a trait or behavior positively benefits a species by influencing the evolutionary fitness of the species. The development of the neural system starts with blank at 3 to 4 weeks gestational age. So what's the first step in the development of the neural system? That is neurulation. Neurulation begins when the blank overlying the blank begins to furrow. So it begins when that ectoderm that's on top of the notochord begins to furrow. So the ectoderm overlying the notochord. Neurulation forms a blank surrounded by two blanks. So neurulation forms a neural groove surrounded by two neural folds. Cells at the leading edge of the neural fold are called the blank and will migrate throughout the body to form disparate tissue. What are those? Those are cells at the neural crest. And then the neural tube will ultimately form what does that turn into? Turns into the CNS, the central nervous system. It turns into the brain and spinal cord. The neural tube has a blank plate and a blank plate. What are those two plates? Those are the alar plate and the basal plate that are in the neural tube. That alar plate differentiates into, what does it turn into? Becomes sensory neurons. The basal plate differentiates into the other kind of neurons. It turns into the motor neurons. There's 3 swellings of the embryonic brain. So what are the very first 3? Those are the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. That's going from front to back. The 5 swellings of the mature brain. So what does that turn into? It turns into the telencephalon, the diencephalon, then the mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myencephalon. And a way I was taught for remembering these final 3, once again, this is order front to back. The way I was taught to remember these final 3 is that they're in alphabetical order. So we have mes, and then we have met, and then we skip right to Y. We don't even have an E there. So those are in alphabetical order. The fetus is attached to the uterine wall and the placenta by the umbilical cord. Okay. The blank transmits food, oxygen, and water to the fetus while returning waste to the mother. What does that job? The placenta. A blank is a behavior that occurs in response to a given stimulus. So if I touch you and you jump, that was a reflex. The blank reflex is the automatic turning of the head in response to a stimulus touching the cheek. So this is a stimulus you typically only see in infants. That is called a rooting reflex. The blank reflex is the automatic flinging out of arms in response to abrupt movement of the head. Once again, something that's typically only seen in infants. That's called the Moro reflex. The blank reflex causes the toes to spread apart in response to the sole of the foot being stimulated. That's what's known as the Babinski reflex. Blank motor skills incorporate movement from large muscle groups and whole body motion. Those are gross motor skills. Those are things like sitting up, walking, moving the arms. And then conversely, blank motor skills involve smaller muscles and more specific and delicate movement. Those are the fine motor skills. That's stuff like moving your fingers, moving your eyes around, those sort of things. In blank, children will play alongside each other without influencing each other. This usually begins around 2 years old. That's what's called parallel play. That's just one of the stages of development that's a pretty important milestone that, that doctors typically look for in children to make sure they're developing in the way that they're supposed to. Gross motor skills develop in a blank order. They develop in a head-to-toe order. When you think about a little baby, the way they develop their motor skills, typically they start by lifting their head up on their own, and then sitting up on their own, and then finally they'll go into crawling and then into walking. So head-to-toe order. Motor skills tend to develop at the blank prior to the blank. So they tend to develop at the core prior to the extremities. Once again, babies can typically sit up, roll over, those sorts of things before they can do things like grasp a pencil, those sorts of things. That's a very extreme example, but that's the point. Social skills move from blank to blank to blank. So social skills, if a baby is developing the way they should move from being parent-oriented to being self-oriented, to being other-oriented, in that order. And sometimes a baby will get stuck at a certain stage. Maybe they end up having stranger anxiety and separation anxiety for a bit longer than they should, and then that can be something that they then have to work on. But typically, there's a certain age range in where they should move through these 3 stages. Okay, that is all the cards I had. Whew, that was rough, I think. Hopefully this was helpful to people. the way I usually come up with flashcards is I go through the book and the notes, and I first start by just reading through it just normally, and then I go through and I try to think of what could be a flashcard, typically stuff like key terms, the vocabulary, that sort of thing, and then I highlight what I think could be a flashcard. That's how I come up with them, but I love to hear the ways other people come up with them as well. Alright, we're going to go ahead and just cut this video because I'm getting tired, and happy studying, everyone.